Well, good morning. Glad to be back here with this next episode of our Election Science Office Hours. This webinar and podcast is hosted by the Lynn Center for Science, Society, and Policy here at Caltech and moderated by me, Michael Alvarez. We now have an archive of 16 of these episodes that are available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And they're on our Caltech Election Integrity Project website at protectingtheelection.us. You can find more information about these past podcasts and webinars on social media. We're on LinkedIn, X, Blue Sky, and also some of the other social media channels. Now, today, this is going to be super fun because my guest today is former Washington Secretary of State Kim Wyman, who's currently a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center and the president of Election Security Innovation Consulting. It's a super treat and privilege to have Kim with us today. For those of you who don't know her personally or by her reputation, which would actually surprise me because she's a widely known expert and most folks in this area know her really well, I'm going to run through her really impressive bio before we get started. So Kim Wyman has 30 years of federal, state, and county level elections experience and currently serves as the Senior Fellow for Elections at the Bipartisan Policy Center, or BPIC, as we'll refer to it today, and is president of Election Security Innovation Consulting, where she's committed to improving election administration and continuing her incredibly successful career to ensure that our nation's elections remain accessible, secure, and accurate. Kim served as the 15th Secretary of State of Washington from 2013 to 2021. And as of 2024, she is the last Republican to have held statewide office in the state of Washington or in any of the three contiguous West Coast states. In November 2021, Secretary Wyman was appointed by President Biden to serve as the Senior Election Security Advisor at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, as we'll refer to it today, where she served for just under 2 years before moving over to BPC. She began her career in elections as the Thurston County Elections Director and served as the Thurston County Auditor for 12 years. So it was during her time as auditor in Thurston County that I first got to meet and got to know Kim. And we had this great opportunity. She really graciously hosted me and some of our academic colleagues when we were trying to learn more about voting by mail, especially security and procedures and processes and chains of custody. And we learned that Kim was doing some really exciting things there. And we got to see the innovative work in person. And I just learned a ton during that visit and in my many interactions with Kim after that. Kim's a graduate of Cal State Long Beach out here in near Caltech, and she earned a Master of Public Administration from Troy State University. And she's the co-author of Elections 2020, Controlling Chaos, with her husband, John Wyman. So Kim, welcome to Election Science Office Hours, and thank you for being here with us today.
Oh, Michael, it's so good to see you, and thank you for having me on.
So first of all, I'm curious about the work you've been doing for BPC. Can you tell us a little bit about what you and your colleagues have been working on throughout the past few months and what elections projects BPC has on the horizon?
Yes, Bipartisan Policy Center has really been focusing on the election workforce as we came out of 2020, and really things changed a lot in the election profession. BPC tries to approach policy from a bipartisan perspective and really relies on research and data to form that policy. So the initial thing that Rachel Ory and her team in the elections division really worked on was creating an advisory committee. It's the Election Workforce Advisory Council, or EWOC, and this is made up of election officials and academics and election professionals, really trying to inform BPC on what it's like on the ground. And that's a great policy idea, but let me tell you how it works in the real world. And that has been a great partnership of those officials. And out of that partnership came a few things. One was a a study that was done with UCLA, Joshua Ferrer and Dan Thompson, who worked with BPC to do a data set over 20 years and looked at how turnover in the elections field has been impacted. Because coming out of 2020, a lot of people made a lot of claims about the turnover, and we actually worked with the data and showed that there has been an overall increase in over the 20 years. And that study has kind of informed some of the work that's been done since, focusing on trying to make that workforce resilient through training, helping state and local election officials work together to make better policies and better procedures and better laws, and then working with academics like yourself through a grant program, trying to get more research in this field so that we can, again, help those state and local election officials through maybe a state association do a better job of training and dealing with this turnover and helping those election officials that are still around working in the field be better at what they're doing. So a lot of work going on, and I really just want to focus on helping those state and local election officials be resilient to the things they're facing in this really turbulent time.
Incredibly important work, and I absolutely love how BPC has built these partnerships between the research community and the practitioner community, which is so valuable. Is there anything like on the horizon, like for 2026 or 2028, that we ought to be on the lookout for, like RFPs for research or anything really kind of new and exciting?
Well, I think really the main thing is just continuing the partnerships. I think the election team at BPC and our task force, which I didn't mention before, but there's also a task force made up of, again, election officials from across the country, and researchers, and just keep tuning in and pay attention to the website, because if they do another round of grants, I'm sure that you would be interested,
All
and
right.
other researchers too.
Pay attention to the website.
Yes.
So in addition to this work that you're doing with BPC, you've started this consulting company, ESI Consulting, and you're the president.
Mhm.
And in your bio, it says that here with ESI, you're working and committed to improving election administration and continuing your own successful work to ensure that the nation's elections remain accessible, secure, and accurate. So with ESI Consulting, what are you currently working on, and what are your long-term goals for this company?
Well, my main goal is to just support election officials as much as I can with my experience, both in the elections world and with CISA. But my focus over the last year has really been trying to create a certification and training program at a national level for election security kind of overall. I mean, that's been certainly a focal point for a number of candidates and campaigns, shall we say, in the last 4 years. And election officials, we have seen turnover, and the election officials that remain really need an advanced level of training for cybersecurity, physical security, risk management, and then that risk assessment and response planning. And so what I've been working on is trying to develop that at this national level to give that advanced level of not only training, but have a certification program that's accredited. And my end all goal would be to have something that's on the par of a CPA, where you have this professional certificate that actually means something in the real world. And so, it's really building on some of the great work that organizations like the Election Center have already built for that baseline of experience and training and taking election officials to that next level. So I'm now working with a university, and we're finalizing that agreement and starting to do fundraising to try to get this idea off the ground.
That's wonderful. I'm glad you've got a university partner for it. The last time we talked about this idea, I was really excited about it. I love this vision.
Thank
Do
you.
how long do you think it would take for an election official to earn this credential? Is this a summer-long kind of program? Is it a year-long program? I mean, what's the vision for how much content that they would have?
Well, the anchor program, the vision for that is a 10-week program. It would start with an initial week of just basic assessment, making sure that either IT professional that supports an election office, or a vendor that supports an election office, or that seasoned election administrator who maybe oversees their tabulation system, has some basic level of understanding and knowledge of the field and the profession. And then the next 8 weeks would be focused on online learning in a cohort, instructor led, about 3 hours a week online with homework and readings and assignments. And then the 10th week is a 40-hour in-person, rubber meets the road, where the cohort is in a location together and really working on some big project, like creating an incident response plan for their jurisdiction. And then it would be finalized with a comprehensive exam, and then they would be certified, and like a CPA, would have ongoing continuing education requirements to keep it. So that's
That's,
the main idea, the anchor program.
I mean, that sounds incredibly comprehensive, and I think well needed. And I really hope that, this comes to fruition relatively soon, because I want to take this course.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I just have to raise a whole bunch of money. And so that's where I'm shifting my focus, and we'll be working with the university's foundation to do that. And we're hoping that some wonderful benefactor or some tech company says, we see value in that and we'd like to invest.
Okay.
Once the program gets off the ground, it will include trainings and seminars and things, and I believe it would be self-sustaining. But right now, what election officials are facing, they really need to have this comprehensive training. So we're hoping to get it up and running in time for the 26th election.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. In all my interactions with especially county election officials, I think this is just an amazing opportunity for them. Not to denigrate them at all, but it's just like a lot of this is just this field continues to evolve quickly. The threat matrix here is just evolving rapidly, and every election cycle there's something new that they need to contend with. And I think helping educate them about how to contend with these threats is just an incredible cause.
Oh, thank you. And when I look back at my career, I remember in the 90s, I needed to become an election expert. And make no mistake, elections is a very technical, regulated profession that is difficult. Just learning that basic level of how to run an election start to finish. And then in the 2000s, following the Gore v. Bush election and the Help America Vote Act being enacted, I had to also become an IT expert.
Mm-hmm.
And then 2016, I had to become a cybersecurity expert. And then in 2020, I had to become a communications expert. And I say that because that is what every election official in the country is facing.
Mm-hmm.
It is a constantly shifting and changing and technically difficult profession. And then you throw in threats of harassment and death threats and all sorts of things. And it's really becoming a bit of a challenge to attract people to this profession.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I actually want to turn to that at this point, and talk about some of the threats and harassment that election officials have experienced, especially since 2020. One of the things that I learned from you, I guess I wasn't really aware about what kinds of threats and harassment election officials were facing until I heard about what some of the things that you and the folks on your team in 2020 faced. And based on the stories that we were hearing from you, this is again where practitioners and researchers and the interactions I think are really valuable. We set off on a research project to try to actually figure out if on social media we could not collect the data necessary to kind of detect these threats and harassments, and to see if we could build something that might help detect when election officials coming under attack and in real time. We recently published that paper, and we didn't quite get to the goal of a real-time detection monitor, but again, we learned a lot from conversations with you and your team on that. And so what exactly have you seen with respect to threats and harassment of election officials and poll workers too?
Well, over the last 4 years, we've seen things we'd never seen prior to the 2020 election. You've mentioned the threats to election officials and their staff and their families, including death threats.
Mm-hmm.
That was really what was the focus coming out of 2020. And then over the lead up to the 2024 election, we were still dealing with, foreign influence campaigns that were trying to divide Americans and pit them against each other and undermine the public's confidence in our election system. We obviously had a large swath of at least the Republican Party who did not believe, and probably to this day does not believe, that the 2020 election was legitimate. And out of that kind of chaos of 2020, a whole bunch of work was done in the non-government sector, working and partnering with people in government. And one of the projects I was really fortunate to be part of, the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, brought together election officials and law enforcement officials. And I can tell you that the first couple meetings we had were a little tense because I don't think either side understood each other's world. So you have on the election official side, when we have a person in a polling place who's threatening election officials, maybe poll workers or voters, and we call law enforcement, we expect them to show up and take care of it. Law enforcement was like, well, that's great, but remember, it depends on the state. So if you're coming from a southern state with a history of law enforcement maybe not being really welcome in a polling place, or maybe actually not able to come into a polling place in uniform, our response may be different than you're expecting. Or a state like Massachusetts, where it's required to have a uniformed police officer in the voting place or in the polling place. It's all over the map. And so we started these conversations, and it was emotional because many of us had received threats, some of them really awful death threats. And law enforcement had to explain to us, well, just because somebody says, Kim, I hope someday you die in this terrible, terrible way, they have a right to say that because it's protected speech. And it really kind of stopped all of the election officials in the room who were really frustrated because law enforcement wasn't taking this seriously, in our opinion. And it made us understand that it has to be an actionable threat. And I mention this kind of in the weeds story because it changed our relationship between the two sides. And we started to understand the challenges that law enforcement faced. Law enforcement started to understand our challenges. And out of that came a series of really great training exercises around the country that were done to bring together law enforcement and election officials and emergency management personnel and start having the conversations about what happens when. When you have a mob standing outside of your election office on election night, what's going to happen? Who's going to be responsible for what? And just having those conversations in advance really changed what happened in 2024. I think from the public's view, 24 was really a nothing burger. Nothing bad happened, and there was very safe and it was secure, and that to a large degree is true. But the Brennan Center has reported that there have been over 227 bomb threats that were called in on election day or in the days after in the voting period, or after the voting period, across the country in multiple states. We had poll workers in some of those locations that didn't even realize a bomb threat had been called in until after the dog and the bomb sweeping team had been through the polling place. And I mention that because most of those threats were coming from foreign countries. We know that because the intelligence community was tracking it. They reported it. They made it declassified and shared that information with election officials. And if you think about that, in 10 years ago, if a bomb threat was called into a polling place, we would have shut the polling place down, cleared all the voters out. It might have taken 2 or 3 hours before they got to go back in to vote, and it would have disrupted elections. Now, what happened because of all the planning that election officials did with law enforcement and others is they had plans in place, and they knew who was in charge, who was going to make the call of when to shut it down and when to open it back up again. And so for the voters' experience, it was much more smooth and transparent, and it was very safe. And we've also seen just things that I never expected in my career to see. White powder being put into envelopes sent to election offices,
Mhm,
in some cases containing fentanyl. We've
mhm,
seen incendiary devices put on ballot drop boxes in multiple states,
mhm.
and detonated. And so, it's a new level of threat, and like you said, it's very complex. And so, I think to kind of bring that question full circle, election officials worked very hard to be thinking ahead of all of the things that could go wrong and happen, and had plans in place to deal with it. And that's why 2024 went so smoothly.
Yeah, I just will have to underscore that because, over the last, I don't know, 20 plus years that I've been working in this area, it's always a great relief when we get through an election cycle and things work smoothly and everybody's like, well, okay, so what? But what the result of that, the reason why we get to that point is because of all the hard work that goes in to
Mhm.
planning to have a safe, secure, and accessible election.
Yes.
Now, what else can we, I mean, that was a great example. What else can we do, especially folks like you and me, standing, outside the world of direct election administration to help the elections community and election officials, especially like in 2026 and 2028?
Um, well, this is going to sound really baseline, but I believe it to my core because I think this was another contributing factor to the success of the 2024 election is, volunteer or sign up to work in the election office, maybe work at a vote center during the
Mhm,
voting period, or work in an election office, processing ballots, or at the very least, tour an election office to find out all of the things that they do to not only protect people's votes and make sure that the whole process is secure, but how they ensure the accuracy of those counts. And I say that because one of the most powerful um, testimonies, I guess, that election officials can get in a community is from community leaders like yourself, or business leaders, faith-based community, military personnel, former and retired or military families. The people that are in communities and are respected for the work they do, when they can say, I've been to the XYZ County election office and I took a tour and I found out that they have these security measures in place to make sure that the paper ballots reflect the tabulation results that are reported on election night. That's more powerful than anything any election official can put online or say because it's coming from a trusted source. And so
mhm,
I think out of the gate, being a trusted source in your own community would be really helpful. And that beyond that, I think creating those partnerships.
mhm,
Certainly, the academic community working with election officials to quantify and help look at all of this data that's coming at them in a more organized way so that they can make decisions that are based on data and not necessarily the political winds that are blowing through their county at that time. And then I think finally it's really about sharing information and training election officials and providing resources to them so that they can do their jobs well.
mhm. So let's pivot and talk about CISA for a few minutes. So you resigned as Secretary of State in late 2021 to work on election security at CISA, and you served there for almost 2 years before joining the bipartisan policy folks. Can you
Mhm.
talk about the importance of the work that you were doing at CISA, and what do you feel that we as an elections community need to be doing in the absence of CISA's dedicated focus on U.S. elections?
Sure. And I think most people watching this are familiar, but if you're not, back in 2017, following the threats that came out of the 2016 election, both President Obama and President Trump designated elections as critical infrastructure. And what this did is it allowed state and local election offices to have full access to the resources of the FBI, of CISA, of getting intelligence information from the intelligence community. And that was unprecedented, and that was kind of a new level of access for state and local election officials. And from really about 2018 until this January, CISA and the federal agencies that they partnered with were working with election officials to do things like physical security assessments, coming into an election office and walking through the voting area maybe, or where they store ballots, and giving them feedback on what could make that physical security safer. Doing the same for their cybersecurity, public facing security or cyber, what do I say, websites and things, but also the back end systems that they have, and doing assessments and making recommendations on how to make those more secure. That was a whole bunch of resources that were available to state and local election officials. There was an organization called the Election Infrastructure Information Sharing and Assessment Center, or the EIISAC. And this was a really powerful tool that election officials came to rely on to have sort of connective tissue between all of these counties that are out in municipalities that are running elections and are online and are receiving threats all of the time. This center was looking at data that was passing through the internet, and they could look at it at a 30,000-foot level and really say, you know, it's interesting, this one website in Iran is hitting every election office that we have a sensor, an Albert sensor on. It looks like that's a malicious actor. Let's go ahead and notify everyone to block that IP address. And what that connectivity did is it allowed us in real time to see threats and address them and respond to them. And the FBI had election crime coordinators that election officials could call and report suspicious activity or potential crimes. And there was the Foreign Influence Task Force that the FBI also had. And I mention all of these things because they all kind of work together to bring the election community a sense of what was happening from a security standpoint and a threat standpoint. And we developed these relationships that really made 2024 smoother because we could get that real-time information and make assessments like, do we close a polling place or not, with a high confidence that we were making a good decision. And unfortunately, those services have gone away. They've been cut with a new administration. And so really the whole community is struggling a little bit to figure out how to backfill those gaps in this community, and how do we rebuild them. And I think that's what most of us are really working to, is filling those gaps.
Mhm. Right. And there's not a lot of time.
No.
Right. We don't
No,
have a lot
there's
of time.
I think, again, many people on this call already know this, but most election offices are already looking ahead to 26.
Mhm.
They're already making plans for how they're going to administer that election. So the clock is ticking, and as one of my colleagues used to say, daylight's burning, and we have to backfill that. Mostly, the thing I look at is that connectivity that we had. How do we get that back? And that's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah, and that's kind of work that's going to fall on the shoulders of the election officials, right? What
Mhm.
what advice do you have for folks like me? What can the research community do to step up and try to fill some of these gaps?
Oh boy, I think off the top, if you're not already doing it, reaching out to your, at the very least, state official, your Secretary of State or Lieutenant Governor, or whoever runs elections in your state, and just seeing if they have any needs
Mhm.
for research or data or information that might be helpful. And I'm going to go back and use an example that kind of is old, but it's a great one. I remember many years ago, your colleague, Charles Stewart at MIT, got very interested in elections, and he started doing a lot of data and research and putting information out there, and started working closely with election officials to refine that, what do I say, his focus.
Mhm.
And out of that has come just great improvements in elections. For example, he worked very closely, or looked very closely at data related to lines at polling places,
Mhm.
and then took that data and helped election officials figured out where the bottlenecks were, and how, using data, they could make their systems more streamlined and more efficient. And that was being able to see the forest through the trees for a lot of election officials have made a difference. So I think reach out to the state election official or reach out to your local election officials in the communities that your university serves, because I think that it's hard to answer what those questions are because one, your election official may not know what data they need. And as a researcher, you may not know what they need. And I think just having a conversation like we did, oh
Mhm.
my gosh, 20, 30 years ago, it's hard to say how long ago that was, about, here's what we do. And then you look at it from a different perspective of data. And I think that that's where those, where that comes out.
I
That,
think that's great advice, and now's the time to do it.
Mhm.
Before they get super duper busy, and you have time as a researcher to start
Yes.
to map out the strategies that you might take to try to help out. So
Mhm.
yeah, I'm gonna have to figure out some ways to put that call out to our colleagues in the election science research community.
Yeah. And one thing that occurs to me too is I know this is the sexy hot topic everybody's looking at, but AI. And
Mhm.
I think, election officials, certainly it's been front and center. I know going into 24, I was looking at it from a threat perspective is how can, in particularly our foreign adversaries be able to leverage AI to do things at scale. But I think there's also just that unknown territory, and election officials are starting to explore it, of
Mhm.
how you can apply AI to make, customer service better. How can you leverage AI to make our elections better? And I think that obviously people like you who are in the trenches dealing with this in real time, that would be super helpful.
Great. That's a great one. I'm going to put a pin on that for a sec. Come back to it because got a nice question from one of our people who's with us live. How much of the emergency response planning falls on local election officials versus state election officials?
Well, ultimately, all of it falls on the local. And I was a state official, so I'm not being disparaging to my colleagues in NAS, but ultimately, it's the local election official who is responsible for planning their election start to finish and making sure that the physical security and cybersecurity is in place to carry off that election. So ultimately, it falls to the local election official. But I also know that my colleagues across the country who run the elections at the state level work with their state, work throughout their state, be it municipal election offices or county election offices, to give them support and resources and help them understand the connectivity that they need to make in their local communities. So I think it's a partnership in the best case scenario, and worst case scenario, if for some reason the state officials aren't engaged, then it does fall directly to the locals.
Fantastic. Thanks. Now, um, you did a lot of amazing work during your tenure as Secretary of State of Washington. So, what accomplishments during that period are you most proud of?
Oh, probably the singular thing I'm most proud of is a project we called VoteWA.
Mhm.
And I'm most proud of it because I got 40 independently elected officials to agree on something and work on a project for 5 years that resulted in a statewide, really connected voter registration database, election management system, and election night reporting system. Um, and this was a huge lift. When I came into the office in 2013, I knew that our system was old and aging and was, I found out at the time, I can say this now, was held together in a lot of ways with baling wire and duct tape. And I knew that it needed to be a group effort and that the counties had to be involved. So I had 39 county auditors who we engaged with and about 200 staff across the state. And this project was just amazing. We figured out the business needs and what they were doing with their individual systems, and we made 41 separate systems into a singular, connected, in real-time system. And this was important not just because the technology was old, but it was important because um, we were about to, the legislature had passed same-day voter registration, automatic voter registration, and the future voter program for 16 and 17-year-old pre-registration. And all of those policy pieces of legislation had to have some real-time connectivity between the 39 counties to really pull it off from a security and integrity standpoint. So we worked on that project. It was painful and it was difficult, and we brought it live in 2019. And I think that that's part of the success of those policies and those laws that were passed. And then it prepared us for 2020 and COVID. So I think of all the things I did in my career, that was the hardest thing we ever did. And it was this incredible team effort, and it was successful, and it was on time and on budget and on scope. And yeah, it was a mic drop moment. I can't lie.
That's great. And so looking a little further back, you were a local election official, elections manager for a few years, and then election or county auditor in
Mhm.
Thurston County, Washington for how many terms? It would three?
Technically four, because one was a partial term. I was appointed and then had to stand for election for a short term and everything.
Four
So,
terms.
but 12 years. 12
Okay,
years.
you were elected and
Yes,
as
yes.
as the county auditor. So what do you miss most about being a local election official, and how does that compare to being the chief elections officer for a state as big and diverse as Washington?
Uh, I miss the direct customer contact, the direct voter contact, the direct, candidate contact, and really being in the middle of the details and figuring out how you're going to lay out the ballot and have candidate filing week and get ballots to voters, make sure they're counted accurately, and the whole process is secure but transparent. I miss that day-to-day minutia because that's the stuff that's the most fun. But it's a scope and the scale. When I think about, being a local election official, it's really retail,
Mhm.
retail service. So you're dealing directly with customers. I had a staff of about 40 people in three offices within about 3 miles of each other, and we served about 200,000 registered voters. And then when I moved to the state, I had a staff of 300 located in 27 offices across the entire state of Washington, and we had about 5 million or 4 million registered voters at the time. So just a different scale and scope. And I think the wholesale not politics, the wholesale service delivery of being Secretary of State is a different customer base. Then I was serving the 39 county auditors and partnering with them on projects as opposed to dealing directly with my voters and constituents. So both of them were fun for different reasons, and I definitely miss the day-to-day, adrenaline, if you will, of being a local election official.
So this path that you took is not the typical path, going from a local election official to becoming an elected statewide chief elections officer for, again, a big, diverse state. So let's talk about that for a couple of
Sure.
minutes. I mean, how did that path work? Why did you decide to take that path? Do you have any advice for somebody who's thinking about, jumping,
Mhm.
making that kind of jump?
Oh, of course, of course. So
Wanna
I
do it?
wish I could say that when I was in high school, I wanted to be Secretary of State. And I made a plan. That isn't how it worked at all. I kind of fell into elections, which I think is very common for most election officials. My husband and I had moved to Washington because of the Army, and he was stationed at Fort Lewis with the Ranger Battalion there.
Mhm.
And I had a job with the county auditor's office as the assistant recording manager, and we were headed back to California, and an unexpected event occurred where we had an embezzlement in the office, and out of that kind of disruption, the auditor asked me if I wanted to be the election director, and given my MPA, given my background and interest in politics, and of course I jumped at the chance. And elections is a profession that you either love or hate.
Mhm.
If you love it, you'll spend your career there. If you'll know if you hate it within the first 6 months, I'd say. And so I loved it. I had an amazing team that had a lot of experience around me and were wonderful and taught me the profession. And had a boss who really wanted to try new things and be innovative. So we were on the front edge of vote by mail and really serving voters in a different way. So it was exciting and interesting. He ran for and was elected Secretary of State in 2000. And again, my husband and I were getting ready to move back to California. So I got recruited to run.
Mhm.
and threw my hat in the ring and learned probably the best lesson of my entire career, in that I had to come out publicly and say I was a Republican.
Mhm.
And I had close friends in Olympia, which is a very blue
Mhm.
city and a very blue county, and they all did the same thing. They went like this: "You're a Republican?" and, and it made me laugh. But what I learned from that was I had been so good at being neutral
Mhm.
that I had this credibility and this reputation for being fair and transparent. And so that really carried me through the 20 years I served in elected office. That even though I was elected as a Republican, once I was elected, I had to serve the entire electorate, whether they were Democrats, Republicans, or independents. And I needed to continue to be that fair arbiter of and steward of that job. And so served as county auditor for those 12 years. And the highlight of that was the 2004 governor's race, where yeah, it was the closest governor's race in the country's history, I still believe, and very difficult thing to go through, but was a really good education in human behavior and how to do your job well.
Mhm.
And so lived through that, and then when my former boss, who was now Secretary of State, Sam Reed, decided to retire, decided that I wanted to be Secretary of State, and so did the statewide run and was elected 3 times at the state level. And when I look back on all of that path, I think the thing that drove me wasn't so much being an elected official. I mean, it's an honor to serve your voters. It's an honor to be elected, but it really was. I had invested so much in building things like our vote by mail program, and I just didn't want to have a partisan person come in and undo that work. And that's, I think, what drove me to run for auditor and drove me to run for Secretary of State. And I can tell you, it was my path was not the normal path, certainly to Secretary of State. I'd say the most telling moment of that was in 2020, when I realized that only myself and the New Mexico Secretary of State, Maggie Toulouse Oliver, were the only two seated chief election officials across the country who had local experience.
Mhm.
And it's still true. I mean, you look at the current group of election or secretaries of state, Adrian Fontes and Maggie Toulouse Oliver, and I'm forgetting one, and I apologize. I know there's one other secretary that have local election experience. Most secretaries and lieutenant governors come from the legislature, or they may be election lawyers, election law lawyers, or advocates. And so to be a local election official and then serve at the state level was really an unusual path. And I think my recommendation to people who are considering a career in elections is, first of all, do it.
Mhm.
Most rewarding career I could have chosen, and I have no regrets, and I loved every minute of it, even the really hard times. But if you're in college or you have a degree, and or looking to what degree to seek, certainly anything in IT or
Mhm.
IS or cybersecurity, those are going to be high demand in elections as well as other career paths, certainly. But policy, a law degree or just a master's of public administration or political science, all of those degrees are going to help you on the policy side. And if you're more interested in operations, you don't necessarily need a degree. Understanding how systems work and how to be efficient and understanding lean principles, all of
Mhm.
those things would serve people well. But it's a very rewarding profession.
Well, I wanted to say one thing, which is that if you asked me what I thought your kind of major contribution was, both from in Thurston County and in Washington as Secretary of State, was your openness and transparency. Um, my experience with you was that you were always, so open and so transparent. You provided data. You really provided this incredible degree of, again, just openness and transparency about your operations, your decisions, what your office at both levels was doing. And I've always, thought of you as a real wonderful example for how open and transparent I really would like to see election officials be.
Oh, thank you. That really means a lot to me, coming from you especially. I think. again, it's those hard lessons you learn early in your career. And I think some of it for me came from being in a Republican office. My boss, when I first started this work, was a Republican in a blue county. By the time I became county auditor, 10 of the 12 years, I was the only Republican in the courthouse. And I think in your introduction, you mentioned being the only Republican on the West Coast. But of the 9 years I served as Secretary of State, 5 of those I was the only Republican on the West Coast. So that's kind of I'm this outlier, and my lot in life apparently is to be the outsider, I guess. And you know that the attacks are going to come from the other side because they want the seat. The Democrats hadn't held the seat since the 60s. So you always know that's coming. And so I always found the best way to combat that is be transparent, be open, don't hide anything. Then there's nothing that they can say, oh, if she hid that, what else is she hiding? And I think it's those lessons you learn in high school from your parents. Your reputation can be shattered in a moment.
Mhm.
So you always have to be working to be more transparent, more open, more forthright with the people that put you there because you represent them and you're the steward of the office. So your job is to represent all of them and do it to your best of your ability. So I took that oath to heart, and I know that my colleagues across the country at every level who raise their hand and take an oath of office do the same thing.
Yeah, they strive towards that ideal. One thing that I guess I didn't realize in it, and now I'm making a connection in my head, that your husband served as Army Ranger. Is that?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
correct.
So when you get a chance, please thank him for his service.
Oh, thank you. I
And I think that it makes a connection here because now I understand why I suspect you had such a passion for the work that you've been doing for overseas and military voters, which is something that we've shared over the years too.
Yes. Well, actually, there's a singular event that I kind of forgot about till this moment. But when we were first married, we were stationed in Germany. That's how we ended up in Washington from California, and we lived there 2 years. So we're in our mid-20s, and I hadn't missed an election since I turned 18.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, one election, a county we won't name, might start with Los Angeles, didn't get our ballots to us until the day after an election. And, there's nothing you can do. At the time, I didn't realize what a big deal it was or how important it was to me until it happened. But it happened, couldn't do anything, moved on. So when I got the job in Thurston County, I made a commitment to myself that no voter under my charge would go through what I went through.
Mhm.
And so we were able to do some really cool things like use email as a way to deliver ballots, which in 1996 was revolutionary. Sounds really archaic now, but we were able to do that for our military and overseas voters. And that was when I really realized, that I have this opportunity to serve people in ways I'd never expected, and very proud of some of the things we got to do. But yes, that I think that individual experience really drove a lot of my work, certainly.
Yeah. That's amazing how those kind of experiences like that just kind of really stay with you. And I know that you were co-chair of the Overseas Voting Initiative.
Yes.
And for folks who may not follow overseas voting and overseas voting issues, the OVI is a collaboration between the Federal Voting Assistance Program, which is the group in the U.S. federal government that helps oversee UOCAVA voting and provide support for UOCAVA voters, and it's a collaboration between FAP and the Council of State Governments to try to help, again, improve the process for these voters who are in many ways just extremely disenfranchised. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you did with OVI and what some of the accomplishments that you think you were able to attain?
Well, first, my co-chair was Secretary Jim Condos from Vermont, and he and I just had a great time working with CSG and FAP and all. And I think that group really brought together election officials from across the country, and we started kind of doing that deep dive of what the real barriers are. And there are real barriers with people that are serving in a war zone or serving, in the middle of Africa, trying to bring aid. Okay, that's probably a bad example in the modern era, but it's just the physical distance and the challenges with technology. And so I think most of us really want to have something simple like, why can't we just use the internet to send them a ballot and then have them vote online and return it? And all those things sound really simple. This is an issue we've been working on since what, 2004, 2006? And there was the Serve
Sure.
project. Yeah.
2000? No, remember there was a project before that,
Oh, what was it?
voting over the internet in 2000.
Oh yes, I know there was. Yes, there was, and that oh my gosh, yes. And all those things sound really good on the surface until you do the deep dive of how do you defend them when somebody starts attacking those votes. And unfortunately, we're seeing that with Uocava votes are being called into question with the president's executive order, and so there's certainly a swath of the electorate that believes that. Somehow the Uocava laws are being manipulated to rig elections. But I think the work we did with OVI, and I know that work is still ongoing now, is so important because election officials need to connect with military personnel on the ground to make sure that they are reaching out to their service members on how they can get a ballot back to their local election office and have it counted, because they should be able to vote for the person who is their commander in chief on a very just fundamental level. But also, we know that the connectivity of your local school board elections and your local municipal elections in your community that you're going to return to someday are important too. So the work we did at OVI was really going out to military installations around the country, talking to commanders and voting officers, and getting them to see that participating in an election is not political.
Mhm.
It is a constitutional right. And sometimes that gets blurred because in the military, they have to be so careful not to cross any political lines. And so a lot of it is just education of connecting with those voters. And we had some great leadership at FFAP that was really trying to serve the needs of those voters. So it continues, that work continues, and it's important.
So as we start to look towards the next two election cycles, the next, midterm election in 26 and then the next presidential course in 28, are there emerging issues for Uocava voters that you're concerned about that really do need policy innovation and research?
I think that the heart of it is, how do you overcome that physical barrier of someone being halfway around the world and not having, especially if they don't have access to the internet, don't have reliable access. They might be serving in a submarine, which is really kind of where some of the original absentee laws came from. Submarine ballots are a real thing still to this day because you're serving on a submarine and you may not be able to connect to the internet for 6 months.
Mhm.
So how do you allow those voters to participate? How do you enable it? I think some of the data on it would be helpful,
Mhm.
because it's hard to pin down how many not only military service members are in the United States out of their home state, but abroad, but also the civilians and volunteers, Peace Corps volunteers to, people that might be on a church mission trying to serve people in a foreign country. How do you enable those civilians to be able to participate and be connected back home? And what's that data look like? And I know there are a number of groups doing this work, but I'm not sure anyone has actually quantified how many, Uocava ballots were cast in the last election. The EVE survey, certainly, that the Elections Assistance Commission publishes after every federal election, gives us a lot of that data. But I'm not sure that it's drilled down to, how many people are voting election day, because
Mhm.
that's the heart of a lot of the criticism of Uocava voters is that if let's say you're in Tennessee and you're a California voter, and on election day you realize, oh my gosh, I haven't voted yet. You have the legal right now, as we sit here today under Uocava, to contact your local election office, fill out a federal voting, I can't think of the right term, fill out an absentee ballot application and get that ballot and vote it right up until the polls close and get it back to those local election officials. And so I think that because those ballots are being called into question now in a way that I've never seen in the years that I've been was formerly a Uocava voter. we need to make sure that the policymakers, particularly in Congress and in the White House with the executive order, understand that these are real challenges that Americans face across the world. And we need to make sure that our service members and our civilians that are serving the United States across the world have an opportunity to weigh in on federal elections. So.
Yeah, I've had you for 55 minutes now. We're getting close to where I should let you go and do your day job. But we should talk more at some point about UOCAVA voters, because I kind of get the sense that, in 2020 and 2022 and maybe 24, we were so focused on COVID and other problems that we kind of want some of the energy, I think, faded in our need to focus on making sure that UOCAVA voters can exercise their right to vote. And I agree with you that I think we really need to renew that and get back to really focusing more on that.
We do. And thank you for that. And I tomorrow actually I'm going to talk to a group called We the Veterans, and that's one of the things I'm going to get on their radar is we have to keep this front and center with policymakers so they understand.
So I am going to let you go in a sec.
Okay. Okay.
But before we do that, I wanted to just tell folks that on October 16th and 17th, we're going to have our next major election science conference. We had one in January. We're going to have one on October 16th through 17th. It's going to be in person at the campus of Washington University in St. Louis. There's material online if you want to come, but the wonderful news is that Kim is going to be one of our primary keynote speakers. You've agreed to join Betsy Sinclair, my co-organizer, and I at that event, and give us some of your insights about, in particular, this question about using AI to assist in the governance and conduct of elections. Is there something you're really looking forward to with respect to this event, and something you're looking forward to talking about at that conference?
Right now off the top of my head, no, but what I find is that when you especially pair academic researchers and election officials and start talking about nitty-gritty weeds level, minutia of how to run an election, that things you haven't thought about come out, and that's what I'm really looking forward to most with this conference is really seeing where we are. In July, things will be different, I'm sure. And where are we? And more importantly, July, that is the right month, right? Anyway, October. I meant October. It's like July seems really close. October. That where we are, because we'll have about a year for the federal election that's coming very fast and furious. And the more we can kind of empower the brain power in academic institutions and pair it with election officials, it's always better for all of us.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. I know we could go for hours, so I'm going to have to connect with you later on to do this again. Is there anything you wanted to mention that we haven't talked about before we close?
No, I think we covered everything. No, this was really great. I really appreciate you having me on, Michael. This is great.
It's a ton of fun, and it's great to see you.
You as well.
With that, I want to thank Kim for joining us today, and thank you all who have been here with us today. And that's a wrap on this episode of Office Hours. Thank you.